Sing along with me, but stop when I say stop. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out to the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks. I don't care if I never get back. Stop. October 17th, 1989. Candlestick Park, San Francisco. The Bay Bridge fell down, man. It's in the drink, man. There was a guy in front of me with a radio. He was relaying news to us. The Bay Bridge was in the drink. We were here for a very unique World Series game. It featured our two local teams, the Oakland Athletics against the San Francisco Giants, which had never happened before and has never happened since. But just a few minutes ago, the earth shook and the crowd cheered, which brought up a bunch of questions. Earthquake, how bad was it? Where the hell was my buddy Darryl? And the biggest question of all, who was I going to root for in this World Series? Now, let me back up a bit. I was born in Brooklyn, which meant that by birthright, my team was the Dodgers. And then one very fateful day, those bums of Brooklyn announced that they were moving to California along with the New York Giants, who I didn't know much about, but I was dimly aware they had a player named Willie Mays who was supposed to be pretty good. Now, with the Giants and the A's, with the Giants and the Dodgers gone, New York went from being a 3-team market to a 1-team market. So there was only one team left in town for me to root for, and that was the Yankees, who I'd hated my whole life. Nevertheless, they won a lot of games, and I enjoyed. They quickly became my hometown heroes. I enjoyed rooting for Mantle and Skowron and Yogi, the Mick, Moose, and Yogi Berra. What kid could resist those nicknames? I watched a lot of games on TV, but I never went to a game. I was the only sports fan in my family. My dad made it really clear he had absolutely no interest in attending a baseball game in person. He said, you know, the traffic is so bad, you'd have a really hard time ever getting there on time, if you get there at all. I believed him. I was 10. What did I know? So I watched games on TV. I listened to games on the radio and very quickly realized that I could visualize the game in my head when I listened to it on the radio and how wonderful that was. But I never went to a game. Now, I was a pretty good sports fan up through high school. When I got to college, things changed. I was suddenly not interested in sports at all, not interested in baseball, football, basketball. I was interested in, learning and girls and drugs, college stuff. And that obliviousness to sports lasted through the 70s. I moved out here to go to grad school. Completely missed the fact that the Oakland A's won the World Championship 3 times. Just paid no attention. And I was happy in my life until one day in the early 80s when it all changed. I accepted a freelance job for Channel 2 in Oakland, going into the locker room at Oakland Coliseum and interviewing Billy Martin, who was then the manager of the A's. Now, despite his cantankerous reputation, he was very nice to me and to my producer Nancy, who was blonde and attractive and most of all female. After the interview, Nancy and I went out into the stands. We didn't have a ticket, but the place was about half full, and I had a big professional movie camera on my shoulder. Nobody stopped us, and we sat there very close to the first base line. I could practically reach out and touch the players, and it was fabulous. It was a beautiful day, and suddenly this sport that had seemed so inaccessible for so long was right within reach. It was very exciting for me. Apparently, I looked around at me, there were not a lot of people there, but there were thousands of people nevertheless. Apparently you could go to games after all. They'd all managed to get there. Wait till I tell Pop the exciting news. The next night I took my wife Susan to the game, and we had a great time. And the following year we celebrated Mother's Day at Candlestick with our infant son. And the year after that, we took my parents to a game in Oakland with our toddler, and we all had a great time. My mom counted balls and strikes. My dad had a great time, despite the fact that he still felt like he couldn't really get there, but he didn't have to drive, so he was happy. And here's where, and besides rooting for Oakland, we lived fairly close to Candlestick at that time, so I was able to slip out and go to Giants games also. So, here's my dirty little secret. For years, I was a bi-coastal baseball fan, rooting for both the Giants and the A's, who played on opposite coasts of San Francisco Bay. See, people jeer at this. I've taken a lot of flack for it. I've been called a bad fan. Apparently, duality in loyalty in sports is not allowed. I've been told you can't root for two teams. You have to root for one team. But why is this so heinous? I mean, my teams, because they were in the same market, one of them was playing at home almost every single day. If one of the teams was on the East Coast, then the game times were staggered. I could watch or listen to 2 games a day. Wasn't I a better fan for watching 2 games a day than just one? Yes, I hear people. One of my son took a lot of flack for this. His friends would say, "How you can't do this?" And a girl in his class said, "It's just too weird, Danny. You just can't do that." And she was a true Blue A's fan because she thought Barry Zito was so hot. So, being bi-coastal isn't always easy. The hardest part is when your teams play each other. The A's and Giants don't play each other. But in the fall of 1989, they were playing each other for the highest stakes there were. They were in the World Series. Who was I going to root for? I was pretty sure I'd root for the A's because I really loved Ricky Henderson and Mark McGwire and Jose Canseco. But I also liked the Giants. They were underdogs at the time. They were down 2-0. Will Clark, Kevin Mitchell, Matt Williams, they were great players, and they were really a lot of fun. So I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I had to bear witness. I knew I wanted to go see the game. So I found a scalper. I paid him way too much money for a couple of tickets. I invited my buddy Daryl, and we went off to Candlestick. Daryl immediately left to go, we've got our seats, and he immediately left to go buy us beers. And while he was gone, the place started to shake like crazy. Now, I was bi-coastal, so I was able to keep my cool. I remember taking Danny to a game that the Giants had hosted where the A's were playing, and he was wearing I decided to root for the home team, and I wore my black and orange Giants regalia. Danny was wearing a Giants t-shirt, a Giants jersey that was open with an A's t-shirt underneath. People gaped and gasped and hooted as we walked by. One person said, "Dude, pick a team." Danny just waved. Because these are the hard choices you have to make when you're bi-coastal. So we got to the game. Daryl went off to buy beers. The place suddenly started to shake, and it was beyond anything I'd ever experienced. I looked down at the field and I could see a huge mound of earth moving across, underneath the sod, moving across from left field to center field, like a gigantic rolling pin gone crazy underground. I looked at the stands to my right, and the grandstand was rippling, concrete, rippling. I looked up at the wind baffle, and it was flapping around like cardboard. This went on for what felt like 15 minutes. Later they told us the quake lasted 15 seconds. But time really slows down when you're in the middle of something like that. Daryl eventually came back from the beer line, and he said, "Bill," he said, "that was crazy." He said, "I was on the beer line, and it shook like crazy, and then nobody left the beer line." He said, "In fact, during the earthquake, somebody cut ahead of me." He said, and after it was over, everybody cheered, and the same thing happened in the grandstand. Earthquake, stunned silence, and then, "Yay!" And I was thinking, why are they cheering? And I was cheering too, because it was the perfect Northern California greeting for the World Series. I mean, San Francisco's got fog, it's got hills, it's got beautiful views. but it also has earthquakes, and it seemed appropriate. What we didn't know is how bad the earthquake was at that moment. Now, pretty soon, it was clear that there wasn't going to be any game that night. We saw the players coming out onto the field. We saw what we found out later were their families coming out, a lot of young women with babies. And a couple of cop cars came out, and they started to signal us to get out of there using their bullhorns, because we realized that the power was off at the stadium, and what we found out was the power was off almost all across the city. Cop cars came out and with their bullhorns going, "Go home! No game tonight! Go home! No game tonight!" So we took a hit, because the sun was going down and there were no lights. Now, we weren't parked very far from the stadium. Daryl and I walked from our seats to my car, and then we drove maybe 2 miles to his place on Potrero Hill. That took us 3 hours. The traffic was so snarled up. No traffic lights, no street lights. And we got there, and I knew I couldn't get home across the Bay Bridge because we were told, in the drink. And I hung out with Daryl and his wife for the rest of that evening. Around midnight, I decided it was time to try and go home. And I decided to drive north through the city to the Golden Gate, and then through Marin and back to the East Bay that way. So I headed out in the Potrero district, and it was very weird. Lights were out, unlike the beautiful, bright city I was used to. Everything was dark and kind of creepy, like that old movie, Escape from New York. Ever seen that? Snake Plissken walking around. And I drove north on Van Ness Avenue, and here the scene changed. There were lots of cars out. The street lights were out everywhere. The traffic lights were out everywhere. A lot of the intersections were uncontrolled. But in many intersections, there were ordinary citizens standing out in the middle of the road, doing their best imitations of traffic cops. Come on, come on, come on, come on. Stop. A number of different intersections, people were directing traffic all by themselves, untrained, but just trying to help. And this kind of spontaneous citizen self-mobilization cheered everybody up, and people waved and honked their horns and said hi, and there was something very sweet about it. I got through the city, I got through Marin and got home, my family was safe. Big sigh of relief. Now, over 60 people died in Northern California during the earthquake, but it turned out that the timing of the World Series game had saved many lives. The quake took place just after 5 o'clock on a weekday during rush hour. Almost forgot. And apparently, when right after the earthquake, Caltrans issued a statement saying that the Cypress structure, there was a double-decker freeway structure in Oakland that collapsed on itself. 1.5 miles of this double-decker freeway fell down. And Caltrans said, given the length of the structure and the time of day, there were probably 300, 400, 500 people trapped in there. But as they very carefully dismantled the wreckage over the next few weeks, they found about 42 bodies. And in the rest of Northern California, there were 12 or 2 people killed. Of course, every death was a tragedy and very sad. But the original estimates were 500 people to 1,000 had probably died. So in many ways, we felt that things had gotten better. There was not widespread damage, despite the Cypress structure and some other major things like that. I called my parents, and they said it looked on the news as if San Francisco was completely destroyed, which was absolutely not the fact. But there was a lot of emotional damage. In the economic lull that followed the earthquake, because the Bay Bridge was closed and traffic had to be rerouted and a lot of things slowed down, there were many aftershocks. My mood soured. I'd take our dog Sophie to the dog park, and I'd get very worried about whether the only access road in or out would be broken in the aftershocks, and I'd get trapped out there. I really wanted to see the Cypress structure and some of the damage in Oakland, so I put Sophie in the car, and we drove, and it was a really unsuccessful trip. We were unable to get very close to it. We walked around and couldn't really see any of the wreckage. And then Sophie threw up in my car on the way back home. I was not the only one. I was depressed, but I was not the only one. on TV anchors and TV shrinks and doctors were advising everybody, get help, get professional help, or just talk to your friends and neighbors, talk to the people around you, share your experience. It's easier to deal with this if you don't feel like you're the only one who's affected. And I thought, oh, maybe I'll try that. I saw my neighbor out on the street, and I went running out there, and I went running up. I started to tell her all about candlesticks, about the rolling pin and the wind baffle, and she looked at me, and I thought, she thinks I'm crazy. And then she told me about her experience, which was that she'd been home when the earthquake hit, and she went running outside, and that's what you're supposed to do if an earthquake hits in the next 5 minutes. Go outside. And she saw the utility poles on our block swinging back and forth like it's something in a cartoon as the earth rolled and shook around her. I went down to the burger depot in our neighborhood and talked to Dave, the owner, as I wolfed down one of his magnificent turkey burgers. And I told him about my experience, and he looked at me and he said that he'd spent 12 hours a day in that shop for the past 30 years. And he'd always felt safe there. And the day of the earthquake, the place shook and glassware and dishes came crashing onto the floor off the shelves, and it really spooked him out. So it did help a bit. Now, it took Caltrans about a month to fix the Bay Bridge. And when they were ready to open it, they announced that they were going to have a big ribbon cutting ceremony out in the middle of the bridge where the break had happened, which was, if you remember the old eastern part of the Bay Bridge, the break was right at the point where the kind of erector set structure started. A 50-foot section of roadway had collapsed onto the lower deck. And in addition to just having a ceremony, they announced that they were going to allow the public to walk out onto the Bay Bridge for the first time in its history. I knew I had to go. I knew I couldn't miss this. I had to bear witness. Somehow being at the earthquake game epitomized the whole experience for me. And I wanted my moment of history. I wanted to bear witness again to what was happening. I took my son Razi out of first grade and explained the historical background to him and dragged him along on the bridge walk. We went to Golden Gate Fields where the state had buses, and they bused us to the base of the bridge just past the metering lights and the toll plaza. And we started to trudge uphill. It was a beautiful, beautiful day, sunny and brisk. Caltrans workers in safety vests and hard hats were out by the hundreds to greet people. Thank you for coming. Welcome back. Thank you for coming. We just felt so honored to be there. Up ahead we could see bunting, and we heard bands playing. We knew Tony Bennett was going to sing I Left My Heart. And it was pretty exciting. A radio reporter pulled Razi aside and interviewed him. And he explained that his daddy, that's me, his daddy had told him that the bridge was, where they repaired the bridge, they'd made stronger than it had been beforehand, which was true. They'd added extra bracing at that part. He said, and his daddy told him that it was important for us to walk on the bridge to show the world that it was safe again. I was so proud of him. And even at 6 years old, he was eminently quotable. So we walked, and we knew we got to a point where we could see pretty far ahead where the ceremony was going to take place. But he was starting to get spooked out, and I was, oh, whoops. And I was, he wanted,
How cute.
What's the hat?
Full Monty.
We're not going full Monty. So we decided to turn back. It was cold, and he was getting scared, and I'd had my moment of history. I'd had my experience, my being on the bridge, tied it all together with the earthquake and the aftermath for me, and put the whole experience together, and that was fine. But what we learned from that whole thing was that no matter how you felt about baseball, no matter who you were rooting for, we were all in this together. We were all on the same team. The healing was well underway. Thank you.